Well, you guys asked for it, so today I'm going to show you how to rebuild an MBR bootloader. This turned out being a much bigger project than I originally expected. Stay tuned. Several weeks ago, I did a video on how to repair a UEFI partition. In that video, I said if you guys wanted, I would do a video on how to repair an MBR bootloader. I got an overwhelming amount of you guys that wanted me to do that video. So here it is. In that last video, I said that repairing an MBR bootloader is easy. However, I guess it's been a while since I tried to fix an MBR bootloader because it turned out being anything but easy. In fact, it turned out to be way harder than I remember it being. But before we get into that, we gotta pay some bills. So check out today's sponsor. Is your copy of Windows 10 unactivated? Well, it doesn't have to be, because with today's sponsor, VIPscd, you can get a valid Windows 10 license for under $20. Stop dealing with that stupid watermark on the desktop, the valid license for Windows 10. Also, with an activated copy of Windows 10, you can upgrade to Windows 11 for free. Just go to the link in the description below and pick up a valid Windows 10 license key. During checkout, use the code CYBERCPU for a 25% discount. Once you have your key, go to your activation settings in Windows 10 and click on the link that says Change Product Key. Enter the product key you just purchased and hit Activate. Now you don't have to deal with that stupid watermark that come with running an unactivated copy of Windows 10. Now, on with the video. So as I said before, it turns out it is way harder to fix an MBR bootloader than it was to rebuild a UEFI like we did a couple weeks ago. It's not harder because the tools aren't available to fix it, but it's harder because the tools that are available simply don't work. Here's the thing. Microsoft doesn't care about MBR anymore. So the tools available to repair an MBR bootloader simply don't work anymore. This also seems to be a very well-known problem. As you will see from this video, the primary tool that we're going to be using to rebuild our bootloader is going to be a command called bootrec. And like most commands, bootrec has a lot of different switches. One of the switches that is necessary to repair an MBR bootloader is fixboot. Unfortunately, the last version of Windows that switch actually worked in was 1703. Fixboot is the switch that actually writes the boot sector to the system partition. Unfortunately, if you try to use this switch in recovery on an ISO later than 1703, which came out in 2017, you'll get an error that just simply says access denied. Unfortunately, there's no workaround. It simply doesn't work. Now, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but this may have something to do with the fact that Microsoft doesn't care about MBR anymore. They want everyone on UEFI. I mean, UEFI is literally a requirement for Windows 11. This might have something to do with the fact of why Microsoft has allowed this tool to be broken for over 6 years. So, in order to follow this guide, you're going to need a Windows 10 ISO of build 1703 or earlier. That literally is the only way this guide will work. And unfortunately, Microsoft purged their download servers of all older builds of Windows 10 before, I believe, 1909. I can't tell you where to get an ISO for build 1703 or earlier. If I did, then the YouTube algorithm would more than likely take this video down with claims of software piracy. But I'm sure you all know where to get Windows ISOs. If you don't, just Google it. They're pretty easy to acquire. But you know, I got lucky and I had build 1703 already burned to a CD that I just ripped to an ISO, and I also had build 1507, which was the first public release of Windows 10. So I was able to test this guide in build 1507 and build 1703, and it worked great in both. So I'm assuming that it should work in every build in between. Now, I normally recommend against grabbing Windows ISOs from sketchy sources, but in this case, we really have no choice. And luckily, we won't actually be installing Windows with the ISO, but instead simply using the recovery that comes on this ISO, so it should be okay with whatever source ISO you can find it at. Now, I'm just going to be throwing this ISO on a USB drive configured with Ventoy. Since I was testing several different builds of Windows 10, rather than make a USB drive out of every build, I just threw them all on a Ventoy USB drive to make it a little bit easier on myself. I did another video a while back showing you how to create a Ventoy USB drive, and I'll go ahead and link that video in the description below so you can make your own. So, find yourself an ISO with Windows 10 build 1703 or earlier, and let's jump on the computer and I'll show you how to fix an MBR bootloader. But first thing we have to do is break the system, because there's no point in fixing a bootloader on a system that boots fine, right? Let's do it. Okay, so here we are in Windows 10. This right here is currently build 22H2. This is a brand new install. It literally has nothing installed on it. So what we're gonna do is we're just gonna create a text document right here. And we're gonna name this text document test. And then from here, we're gonna open this up and we're going to write, I guess we fixed it. And then I'm gonna go ahead and save this. And I'm just doing this just so you guys can see that we are dealing with the same version of Windows. Once we repair it, we'll be able to open this test document right here when we get this thing rebooted. So the first thing we need to do is go ahead and plug our Ventoy CD or USB drive into the computer. And then once we do that, we can get this thing booted into recovery and we can break it. So let's do that now. So to get your system booted up into your USB drive, you're gonna have to follow whatever manufacturer specific things you have to do on your computer in order to get it booted off of a thumb drive. On mine, I'm just hitting delete to go into the BIOS, and then I'm gonna overwrite the boot. And to do that, I'm simply gonna go right here, go into my boot menu, and pick my flash drive right here. And then once this thing boots up into recovery, I'll meet you there. Okay, so once we're booted up onto the Windows Setup CD, all you gotta do is hit next, and then we don't wanna hit install now. We wanna click on repair your computer. And then from here, we're gonna click on troubleshoot. We're gonna go to the command prompt. Now we're having to do this from recovery because unfortunately, Windows 10 won't allow me to break it from within Windows itself. So I had to do it from recovery. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna go to the C drive here. And as you can see, there's nothing in this drive. So if we go directory, switch A, it'll give us the directory of everything no matter what its attributes are, even hidden files. And from here we can see we have a couple of files that are pretty important. Like we have boot manager and we have the boot directory right here. Now on this system right here, boot manager is essentially your boot sector. It's located at the very beginning of this partition and it tells the system what to do when it boots. Now your boot sector is made up of 512 kilobits of data at the very, very beginning of the drive. And now the 460 kilobyte boot manager is the boot information. It tells the system how to boot. The remainder of that 512 kilobyte is actually your partition information. So it was a little bit difficult to figure out how to break this system. So keep in mind, this portion of the guide isn't something you should be following. This is actually just to break the system so I can show you how to fix it. I don't recommend following this part of the guide because there's no reasonable reason to break a bootloader unless, of course, you're making a YouTube video about it. In that case, go on ahead and do it. But for your system, I highly recommend against doing that. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go ahead and just delete a couple of these files and make the system unbootable, and then I'll show you how to fix it. Okay, so we're gonna go completely scorched earth on this one. The first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna remove the boot directory completely. And then I'm also gonna delete the boot sector, which is this boot manager file right here. So to do that, we use the attrib command. And we want to subtract system, hidden, and read-only from the boot manager. And then from there, we can just delete the boot manager. And unfortunately, at this point, the system won't boot. But we're going to go one step even further, and we're going to remove the directory. We have to use the S switch because the directory has something in it, boot. And then from there, it asks you if you're sure. I'm gonna hit yes and okay. So now when we hit directory switch A, you'll see that we're missing a few things. So let's get this thing rebooted and we'll go ahead and see if it boots. Just a spoiler alert, it won't. So we're gonna fire it up now. I'm gonna go ahead and take my USB drive out and we're gonna see what happens. Might take it a second to fire up, but it's not gonna take it long to error out. And there we go, an operating system wasn't found. Try disconnecting any drives that don't contain an operating system, press Ctrl-Alt-Delete to restart. And we're essentially non-bootable at this point. So I'm gonna plug this back in, we're gonna get back into recovery, and I'll show you how to fix it. Okay, so we're back in recovery here. We're gonna go ahead, just like before, we're gonna hit next, and we don't wanna install it, we wanna hit repair your computer. And then from there, we wanna go to troubleshoot, and then we wanna go to command prompt. And here's our command prompt. Now, one thing that I have to add, and I should have probably said this earlier in the video, is when you're booting from recovery, make sure you boot in recovery in MBR, because a Windows install CD can both be booted MBR and UEFI. You want to make sure not to boot UEFI if you're going to be repairing an MBR bootloader. So make sure you just boot into recovery using MBR. So let's move on. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to want to do, obviously, is we have to determine what drives contain our boot files. Now, I already know this, but I'm going to show you the process in which how you can figure this out. And to do that, all you got to do is type diskpart. And then once diskpart opens up, might take a second, you can go list disk. And this will show you all the different disks that are on the system. So obviously here I've got my USB thumb drive, which is disk 1, which is about 60 gigs. And then I've got my 1 terabyte SSD that is my main drive. And this is the drive that has all of my different Windows partitions on it. So obviously we want disk 0. So for that, we're going to hit SEL for select, disk 0. And then from right here, we want to see what volumes are available on that disk. So we're going to type in list, VOL for volume, and that's going to show us all of our different volumes. And as you can see here, we have a virtual DVD-ROM, and that's from our Ventoy install. We have our removable partition. This one right here is the USB drive. And then you can see these 3 partitions in the middle. We have C, E, and F. Now on C drive is a system reserve partition that's only 50 megabytes. And then number 2 is the E drive, which is an NTF partition with 930 gigabytes. Clearly, this one right here is our Windows install. And then we have the F drive, which is 522 megabytes. Now, this is going to be our recovery partition for Windows 10. This system reserved partition right here is what Windows uses to kind of hide all the boot files so that they're not on the main partition. So you can't actually see this partition from within Windows. It's a hidden partition. So all your boot files are contained on that drive right there. So now that we know that, we can go ahead and exit diskpart here. So once we exit, we'll remember that that one was C. So when we go to the C drive, you'll see that it actually has nothing on it because all the files on it are hidden. So if we hit directory, switch A, just like we did before, you'll be able to see all the files with all of their attributes. And you can see pretty quickly that our boot directory and our boot sector are missing. They're missing because we deleted them. And you know, the reason why I deleted those 2 things is because they kind of encompass everything that could possibly happen to leave an MBR system not booting. So by fixing both of those missing files, it should be able to fix most problems with an MBR boot. So let's fix it. Okay, so now that we're on the C drive, we want to check the E drive real quick, because the E drive, as we could see from diskpart, was the drive that it was probably our Windows partition. So when we go to E and run a directory, as you can see, there's our Windows folder, there's our user folders, our program files and whatnot. So this one, we can be pretty confident that this is our Windows folder. So from here, we want to go back to the C drive. And then from here, the first command that we want to create is we're just essentially going to recreate all the boot files that we deleted before. So to do that, we're going to type in bcdboot space, and then we want the path to our Windows folder. Now we know that's in the E drive. So it's going to be E prompt / Windows. And then from there, we want to hit a space. We want to hit switch capital S. And then we want to specify what our boot partition is. Now in this case, our boot partition is actually C, while our Windows partition is E. So we want to make sure to specify that one right there. So we're going to go ahead and write C prompt for that. However, keep in mind that if your boot files are located on the same partition as your Windows directory, you're going to have to change this command accordingly. Just make sure you specify these 2 things individually: your Windows directory, the specific partition and folder that it's located in, as well as the drive that all your boot files are on. And then once you do that, go ahead and hit enter, and it'll say boot files created successfully. So if we run a directory now, and obviously we have to do directory A because these are all hidden files, you'll see that our boot folder and our boot manager are back the way they were. However, it still won't boot. So we're still gonna have to do a few things in order to get this thing to boot. So the next command we're gonna run is bootrec. This is the one we talked about earlier. And we're gonna have the /scanos. And all this is gonna do is it's gonna scan for Windows operating systems that it can find on the system. And as you can see here, it says total identified Windows installation 0. Now this is an error that you may come across. And if you do, it's really easy to fix. All you gotta do is hit cdboot. And then from there, the file that we're looking for is this one right here. It's the BCD file. And all this means is it threw a generic BCD file in it that just isn't compatible with our MBR system. So it's easy to fix. All you're gonna have to do is hit REN for rename, and then type in BCD, and then give it another name. So I'm just gonna call it bcd.bk for back. And that'll give you a backup copy of your BCD file. So if we scroll up here, you'll see that it just says backup now. But we currently have no BCD file, but that's okay. Let me show you how we can fix that. So the next thing we do is we go back to our root directory here, and we're gonna run bootrec again, but this time we're going to have /fixmbr. And then from there, it'll say operation completed successfully. And then the next command we want to type is going to be fixboot. Now, this is the command that will fail if you're not using a 1703 or earlier ISO. But when I hit enter, you'll see the operation completed successfully. If you get the error that says access denied, then that means you're using too early of an ISO. You're going to have to use an older ISO in that case. Now, the next switch that we're going to run is still bootrec, but this time we're going to type in rebuildbcd. And now rebuildbcd, because we deleted the BCD file before, this is actually going to rebuild the BCD file based on our boot configuration that we're currently using. So once I hit enter, you'll see it's scanning all disk for Windows installations, and it found one this time. So we got eWindows. And the reason it found it is because we deleted the BCD file before. So all we're going to want to do is click yes. We do want to add these to our installation. So hit yes and hit enter, and it'll say the operation completed successfully. Now there's one more thing that we have to do, and we have to go back into diskpart again. So go back into diskpart. And it takes a second to start. Once it does, we go list disk, and most of the stuff you may already know. Like we already know disk 0 is our boot drive. So we're going to go select disk 0, and then from there we have to do list volumes to see our volume. Now the volume we're looking for right now is not the Windows volume, but it might be. It's a little complicated. But what we want is we want to know which partition actually has our boot files on it. We don't really care where the Windows directory is. We want to know where the boot sector is located. And in this case, we know it's on the C drive. Well, if you don't have a 50 megabyte reserve partition on your system, then your boot files are probably going to be on the main partition. And in that case, that's going to be the one you're looking for. We want to know specifically where our boot files are. And in my case, it's going to be on this 50 meg system reserve file. So for there, we're going to hit select volume 1, because volume 1 is our C drive, which is our system reserve drive, and then hit enter. It'll say that the volume 1 is selected. And if you want, you can actually hit list VOL to list volumes, and you'll see a little star in the end there to tell you that that is the currently selected volume. And then from there, all you have to do is run one command, active. And what that's going to do is it's going to mark the boot drive as active, so the system knows which partition has all the boot files. And then from that point, we can hit exit, and then go ahead and hit exit again in order to exit out of the command prompt. Now, the next thing we need to do is reboot this system, and hopefully it'll boot Windows. Let's find out. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it off. I'm going to pull the USB drive out of it, and we're going to hit the power button, and we're going to see if we boot into Windows. If everything went the way that it's supposed to, we should have fixed the MBR bootloader and gotten our Windows back. But I don't know, it could fail. If it does fail, I'll just have to film this entire section again, but hopefully it won't. So here we go. There we go. It's booting into Windows. Now, once it gets there, I'll go ahead and see you in Windows. We'll check to see if our text file is still sitting on the desktop. Okay, so as you can see, there's our text file. If we open it up, I guess we fixed it. So as you can see, it is possible to fix an MBR bootloader. In fact, when the tools are functioning correctly, it's pretty easy. Now, the biggest takeaway from this guide that I want you guys to remember is that this guide, as I said at the very beginning of the video, has to be done with a Windows 10 1703 or earlier ISO. And you know, another takeaway is that you should probably keep your old Windows CDs, because this one kind of saved my butt. But now I have it on as an ISO, I really don't need the CD anymore. But it's really important to keep your old Windows CDs for that reason specifically. I mean, the likelihood is that I'm never going to install 1703 again, but you never know what you might need the ISO for. But you know what? The next important thing that you guys need to pay attention to is what partition your boot files are located on. It's really important to know the specific partition in order to follow this guide. In the Windows install that we used in this video, we had a dedicated 50 megabyte partition at the beginning of the drive that contained all of our boot files. And that's what you get when you have a fresh install of a newer build of Windows like 22H2 that I used in this video. However, if your system was originally set up with an older build of Windows, all of your boot files might be on the main partition. And if that's the case, you need to adjust the instructions from this guide according to what partition your boot files are on. Ultimately though, if you're still running an MBR partition, it might be a good idea to convert that partition to GPT. That is, of course, if you're running a UEFI BIOS. If that's the case, you can always follow this guide here to do that conversion without losing your data. Just keep in mind that that video only works on a system with a UEFI BIOS. If you try to follow it with a system with an older BIOS, your system won't boot anymore. But as always, you guys have a great day.